We are live. Welcome to another episode of Unscripted, and I have the great pleasure to introduce Dennis Underwood. Thanks very much for joining me, Dennis. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me.
Listen, I love interviewing security professionals that are contributing to the space, and you've been very active on LinkedIn. You have a huge following, and love to maybe to clean up palettes. Just walk me through memory lane
Oh,
and maybe
wow. Okay.
describe me how you started. Maybe what was your even in childhood like. I find very many security professionals have exhibited curiosity growing up, maybe through the parenting or through the environment. So maybe whatever you can contribute, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think the security practitioner's journey is orthogonal to what the manual says, right? That's just a given just for the industry. Yeah, I guess my background, I actually was trying to get my first job, right, where there were a bunch of layoffs. You and I probably remember in 99 when things weren't so hot in the IT world. And I was interviewing with a bunch of folks at the time were old guys. That's now me, right? And I realized I couldn't get a job at 20, so I came back as Dennis Underwood LLC, and magically they liked that. And so fast forward, I ended up graduating college with a house and kid on the way, two dogs, a lawnmower out back, and no college debt actually, which was nice. I had learned I can live life dangerously and just go one contract to the next, right? So that's kind of how I started. But yeah, I guess while in grad school, I took on a peer-to-peer botnet, which is considered unbreakable, and I found a way in to take it over. And there's actually a cool story about that. Essentially, I ended up working over at the Department of Defense up at Fort Meade. Just some cool adventure.
You got muted by mistake. Can you try to unmute it? Let me see. Trying to unmute the. It's just trying to unmute this. There's a button here. Unmuted.
That
Yes.
work?
Yeah, that worked. Can you check the audio? Because I think the audio was doing a little bit of something funky.
Yeah, let me go
Yeah,
to
pick and choose. I don't know if there's setting there. You can might have to choose a different audio.
health check passed, and that is I have the noise canceling whole webcam setup. So let me see if it should be good. Let's see, mic is the echo. Yes, go back. So everything looks
Yeah,
good
there's a
on
bit
my.
of a buzzing sound that's coming from every time you speak. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's
How about
there's
that? Is
something.
that better?
Yeah,
Yeah.
much better. I don't
Oh,
know
you know
what you
what?
did.
I wonder if close to the laptop. Let's do this.
Yeah,
Is that
much
better?
much better, like night and day.
Okay.
Awesome.
Wild.
Awesome. And so what attracted you to do the continuing education? You mentioned that you went to grad school. I'm assuming you were doing some sort of thesis around computing. Do you remember that? What was that like specifically? What attracted you to actually pursue that?
Yeah, I was always into technology. I think nowadays, not to sound like an old man shouting at the wind. Back in the day, in what the 80s, things were always broken in the computers, right? It was always a mess, right? Wires everywhere. And so you had to really learn that if you wanted to play Civilization, there was no 2, 3, or 4 or whatever nowadays. But and so I think just growing up with a car that seems to always be broken, you learn to fix things along the way and make them work long enough to play your game or whatever, right? Fast forward or get online, right? Fast forward, I think that really makes you want to fix things. Or there's like that meme where the guy got a job at the software company and then he fixed the bug that he always wanted to fix and then he breathed a sigh of relief and then quit. And it's kind of like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you remember the first days of where you start looking at malware and maybe some attacks? What was that like? Again, because you've people don't realize it builds up. I find that every role that you have builds up upon another role, and it's almost like a pyramid, right? So you don't just all of a sudden one day wake up and have a certain skill set. It's a very much a build up.
Right. I think it was a mix of being an IT administrator and being someone who was hacked a lot. Growing up, it was always my brother would turn off the antivirus. And of course, that made for some wild times on these internet forums, IRC and everything. So that kind of started it, right? And then you realize that there's as much EQ as IQ in threat hunting, right? Because you're like, okay, this feels like it's not normal. Let me try to prove it. Right side, left side, the brain. Let's try to prove, right, what I feel in my gut. And so that's kind of the whole journey for threat hunting, really.
Yeah, it's interesting that this is the second time today that it's a this is the second time that I hear. So this is the second time today that somebody mentioned the gut microbiome in decision making. And even though we're a very analytical profession where a lot of it is bits and bytes, right? But as you mentioned, there's a lot of EQ associated with it. So, do you remember the first? And I think threat hunting is something that is a bit of an enigma to a lot of people, but also has this halo. I think that's almost what's the equivalent of that of threat hunting in the physical world, like a spy or like an investigator, like a Sherlock Holmes kind
Yeah, I feel like it's the myth of NCIS, right? Where or Law and Order, where you have all these super talented people somehow scraping out a living in New York City on what city employee pay, and but they're all like geniuses at heart and analytical minds like Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, it just seems when I think of threat hunting, there's like different levels. So when I go to an organization like for an engagement. We don't do as much now because now I'm a product CEO and it's a different world and I spend my life in Excel. But otherwise, on the threat hunting, you start with okay, let's just look at what is already being produced by the tools where folks should be looking. If I see that's covered, if there's folks that are knowing how to use whatever proprietary SIM is in place to look at all the data, my next step was always once I got that past that point was okay, now let's switch hats for a second. Where is nobody looking? Sure enough, the cockroaches are always behind the stove. So, like, where people aren't looking, right? And that's just the way it works. Like, they're doing the same thing you're doing, which is evading I don't know, like the Sigma 6 black belt kind of stuff. They're on Sigma 7 no matter what's happening. That's where I've learned to always look. And there's been some fantastic discoveries. I recently saw like a forum post about how the number of threat hunters who have been told not to disclose the breach, like that there's a really high number of folks like that. And I'm like, yeah, I see that because you turn in your assessment and then they say thank you very much. And sometimes you just had the feeling that it was going right to the shredder. Like, it was going right to the garbage can. It wasn't gonna be dealt with in a public way.
and I'll double click on that, but in 2 seconds. But let me ask you this: do you remember like the first time you did that? Do you remember what was it like? And in specifically, it seems like it's not that glorious. There's a lot of like hard, like just if you were talking about Sherlock Holmes, a lot of staking. You sit in a car waiting for something to happen. In the virtual world, it's almost the same, right? So you can sift through massive amount of data, trying to figure out is any anomalies, is something that happened, and then all of a sudden you get a glimpse of that, and sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes it's just like, walk me through the that experience for people that are not aware, because again, I'd like to unravel what does that mean to be a threat hunter and specifically what that experience looked like. And I know you're a CO now, but you still have the background,
Of
so
course,
and
yeah, yeah.
and and the passion for it as well. I can tell.
Yes, absolutely. So it's just I had to change roles to get where I wanted to be, like in terms of what I wanted to implement. Threat hunting, after you get past the initial kind of, we'll call it the book threat hunting, where it's a discipline of looking at certain metrics and behaviors, things like that. Once you get out of that boundary, kind of crossing the border to the newer stuff, what you end up having to do is it's essentially the scientific process that we all learned and then forgot from high school, where you build up hypothesis if it's currently being looked at by someone or something else. And then if it is, of course, okay, what's the coverage? But you look for gaps in what's being done. You hypothesize a behavior, and then you implement with the amount of data there is nowadays. It's much different than it was 20 years ago. But what you do is now is you say, okay, let me build some analytics around collect the data if I have to, or if it's already there. Usually it's already there nowadays. Then what you do is you say, here's my hypothesis, I'm going to implement it, and here's the effect I should see if a hacker is pursuing this. And you'll end up with some really interesting results. What's interesting is it's very similar to me in my kind of amateur view of that world of like peer review science, where you had a hypothesis, you proved it when you're hard, and now you have to have a peer review journal to people that have the second phase of convincing everyone what you found was real, that black holes exist or whatever. And it's a whole second process, right? The second half reminds me of we're doing our first fundraise. I haven't had to until now, or if we you can't it's harder to organically add 25 salespeople at once versus get some funding. And in terms of that, it reminds me of that where you're pitching to people something you know is true, but it says you have to convince them, and some folks just can't be convinced, and others are right on board. So it's a very interesting journey. Again back to the EQ, right? By the data. Now you have to switch on your EQ hat and say, okay, let's go ahead and start convincing these business people that there's really a problem.
And when you are investigating, and come across a certain methodologies, a certain type of breach, and so on, do you kind of get create almost like a relationship with the adversaries? It's like the same thing as when talking about these Sherlock Holmes or a detective. It seems like there's always some sort of relation to the other side where they almost associate themselves and start to get a feel of their DNA and what they're like. Is that also true in threat hunting? So you get a feel of who's on the other side?
You can. I've chased it down. I think in grad school is when I had the first moment of moving from chasing stuff that kind of appears in a lot of forums to like the really hard stuff that is the higher tier folks. You chase them down, you end up finding things like fake addresses, shell companies. I think with Panama Papers came out, I actually traced a couple all the way through 20 levels of redirection. And then the wife stopped me before I did something stupid and said, "Look, I love you. I don't want to lose you. Just drop it. These people don't want to be found." But like, I guess the point is, yes, you can, but it takes extra work to get to the point where you can identify the actual person. But you definitely get flavors of behaviors. What's interesting with the connectivity and collaboration on the internet, which of course, hubris says that hackers don't talk. Of course they talk. They're always collaborating, and you'll find the same, we'll call them training methods between different parties that otherwise supposedly don't talk. And then you're like, oh, look at that. They saw the article too. Now they're following the same pattern. So it's more like I can usually trace down behaviors down to, and tools, tradecraft down to maybe like a Stack Exchange or a GitHub repo or something like that, where I'm like, oh, they saw that too, huh? And that's where I see it mostly.
And do they leave like crumbs or almost like a signature who did something and then basically left their logo or a stamp of, because there's some of them are proud of being able to
Yeah.
actually pull off these.
When we started on the ransomware product, so in the beginning it was all decryption. Now it's like we really beefed it up and it's all prevention and everything, right? And the ransomware malware developers actually were calling us, and not the attackers, but the developers. And what was interesting was that there was definitely a relationship between the quality of the code, the quality of the craft, and the professionalism of the malware authors, the malware team. And so what you saw was that the ones who they'd give us a call from their burner phone, of course, not from their home phone, like everyone was going to call right from KGB headquarters, like people think. And the ones who were very professional, it was more of like a meeting of minds. Like I remember the one call was from a burner phone from like Donbass region, Eastern Ukraine. They're busy now, right? But like it was before the war. And what happened was that I got on the phone and I was like, okay, this is more of a counterintelligence exercise. I got to figure out what they know about me. And 30 seconds in, the guy said, okay, let me cut to the chase. And he naming functions. And he was like, look, we've already reverse engineered your stuff. Like I have IDAPRO and Ghidra up. So let's stop pretending we don't know what each other's doing. And it became a conversation of professionals. But then we got a phone call like the next week from a guy up in Bangladesh or Pakistan, and from a burner phone, of course. And he was calling me all kinds of MF like language. I had to look up. I know I was being insulted, but I had to look it up because I'm not hip to the lingo. And I was like, I don't think they're going to be as successful because they're not as cool and calm and professional in their approach. And that's what's interesting is that these folks have a lot of money at stake, and cooler minds seem to prevail. And I've watched them grow over time. And it's interesting to see how the professionalism and the discipline that you need on the threat hunting also exists in parallel on the criminal side, only with a
Yeah,
lot more money.
it's yeah. It's amazing feedback, and yeah, it's a lot more money. You never thought about. I've heard of people that kind of were on the other side and converted. Did you ever think that, but maybe you're playing the wrong side because you could probably make a lot more money doing illicit things.
I think we definitely could. And I was involved in some operations for the military, right? So it's certainly doable. But I don't think I'm one of those people who grounds themselves on a really strong, like ethical and moral kind of standing. So I think that would foundationally have to be a change in who I am to be able to do that. I'm one of those folks who, the wife, kids by now will tell you, like, if it's a bad day at work, I'm not good at the whole like, hey, I'm gonna try to like do something really awful at work and then come home and just be that normal guy in the suburbs. Like it's like I carry my work home with me, and I carry my home life to work with me.
Yeah, and definitely sleep better at night.
Yeah.
Some of these people are they're arrogant, right? So we've seen somebody who was, I believe it was in Russia and Ukraine, and they decided to go to Poland on vacation or something and got extradited. And that was very arrogant, very stupid to do, and especially when they were very flamboyant with spending money. And also, is 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 that because they're behind a screen that they don't realize that yes, there's some consequences, or maybe w- w- is in their DNA to become so careless in terms of them being caught?
I guess the first point is that you have folks who didn't have a ton of money and suddenly they have possibly hundreds of millions of dollars. Of course, getting it out of Bitcoin is always a secondary challenge. I think that's why they've started to talk to more professional launderers who like to figure out how to get that out, right? But I think the first is just it's really hard to spend that amount of money, right? And they don't have the professionalism. It just goes right back to the folks that are very professional are the successful ones because they're disciplined in their approach. No different than Jason Bourne type movies we all love to watch and think that's real or whatever. But I think it's very similar, right? It comes down to personal discipline and financial discipline, right? Having said that, what I've seen is that whenever I saw the Bitcoin stuff happening and the hackers weren't even really rotating Bitcoin wallets a lot. And if you understand how Bitcoin works, you can watch the transaction happen without belaboring the issue and they weren't even doing like the normal kind of money laundering and financial maturity that you'll see even in products and stuff like that.
Yeah, like
Where,
moving into Monero, some other coin.
yeah, so it's like I'm always going to use this bank to in my same account number to walk into the teller with my cocaine money. But I'm never going to change it for 3 years. And oh my gosh, the cops knew who it was. So imagine that, dude. So it seems like all of a sudden they had all this success because the market, the dark web markets changed in 2019 to be more extortion focused due to the flood of data, right? And all of a sudden these folks are no different than a Silicon Valley CEO that's making mistakes. All of a sudden they had a whole bunch of money and they didn't have the maturity to deal with that. And so for me, I'm like, we're going from essentially almost zero in terms of like trade craft to having to grow up real quick on how to hide it. And I think whenever the FBI did their raids, I think that a necessary thing. But when I saw that and I was like, oh, they must have gotten all the money. I figured they did all the legwork. And then they got back a pittance compared to what was stolen. And I was like, "Oh no, you didn't get the top side to get all the money back." But now all the hackers know that they need to like mature their financial laundering mechanisms because they know you're going to take their money. And so it almost created a bigger problem, right? By it's like taking your antibiotics for 3 days out of 12, right? Now you have a bigger problem on your hands possibly.
Yeah, it's interesting. And these hacker groups are also very much evolved. It used to be the individual ones that went on their own, and now there's like almost like hacker houses where everything is a service. You can rent those tools, and then they give you the office space and whatever, and then they take commission. So the
Right.
whole thing is an enterprise. Talk to me about that and how that progressed, and what's the effect on commercialization of that to the defender side. How do we deal with it? Something that's all commercialized.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I switched over to when I saw the opportunity with doing a ransomware and a blackmail and extortion specific product was that I had been watching and finding these massive data exfil streams for years. But of course no one wanted to hear about it to the point where we sometimes folks would turn off the sensor if it was like too damning. And what happened was that the extortion it quickly became so popular and so profitable it really was a commercialization exercise for the attackers. We were watching where they essentially, you replace the kind of like the law enforcement lingo with maybe startup or scale up lingo. Then so they have a channel program now. They have resellers, right? They have MSPs. They had to outsource their help desk operations. There's a commercialization equivalent to everything they've been doing. And the challenge for them was to capitalize on the success. I think it was due time. If you look like the market economics of the attackers, they had gotten so successful at stealing data that their profits have been dwindling for a while. It was like just happened all of a sudden, just around the time that COVID kind of appeared. This was the big ramp up where almost like a product pivot in a company where they found their niche and all of a sudden profits were going through the roof. And that's kind of what happened, right? It's really no surprise because what they're doing is they're very entrepreneurial like in that they're all of this was designed to increase scalability and to increase market capture. Really is all it is, right? And of course, there's lessons learned along the way, but essentially what happened. I will say over COVID, Nothing was worse because when we did decryption and cryptanalysis and everything, nothing was worse than finding a new entrant who thought they could just be a lone wolf and let's make a whole ransomware suite because it was always broken software. The just like us on the good guy side, good software takes teams and it takes discipline and project management and ticketing and everything else, right? So to bring the level of quality of the software up, you needed to have more than one person, right? Every time I see where there's a raid and like the one person's responsible for some global enterprise of really high quality ransomware and all the operations, and they're like, oh, it's all that one guy. And I'm just like, come on, are we really that stupid? Anyway, I hope that answered your question and
Yeah.
my meandering data diatribe.
No, no,
you know?
this is great. This is a great conversation. And we're talking about some major revenues to them. We're talking about trillions of dollars. It's almost like a part of the economy, GDP is based on that. So this is no joke. It's not because it used to be. I remember like ransomware used to be like okay, $500, $1,000, $10,000, $50,000. Now it's in the millions.
Yeah, I have
And
a theory as to why it's capped out a little bit. What I was seeing was that the ransoms were not climbing as steadily, but at the same time, I was watching where if the ransom wasn't as high, a little bit lower, then the company didn't have to worry about bankruptcy. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I saw the reinfection rate went up to 80% or higher. I was like, okay, so we're on the path to having an extortion scheme where Uncle Larry owns the butcher shop, right? And every month someone comes by and collects $100 kind of model. And I watched, and the what's interesting is that we see where the it takes less signatures and less people in the know to move around little bit less money, knowing you can just keep on going. And then I was watching, and I found that really interesting, in that it's easier to move that kind of money around in general now that cyber insurance is catching up to the rest of the world's insurance, where you don't make a homeowner's insurance claim if you don't have to, because you know it's going to increase the rate or they'll drop you. And we're seeing cyber insurance. And I'm like, you know what? Anyone who owns a home or has done like an auto insurance claim for a wreck knows if I can pay for it on my own pocket, I'll make more money in the long run. And so I think that's all driving some stability in the single payout for a ransom. But what's happening is it's setting us up for repeated ransoms coming down. And that's a scary place to be.
it's so interesting because pricing is an art. It's both on the vendor and the services side as now as you describe it on the adversary side as well. They've realized that they had to play around with it to make sure that they continuously profit. And it's also like the parasite. You don't want to kill the carrier.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
You want to make sure they're there to tomorrow so you can ransom them again. And let's kind of shift gears to this quickly. W- What is the issue, the underlying issue with ransomware? Why is it so freaking difficult to solve? And because it's been
Great.
around for a long time. Let's do a quick primer of what that is and maybe where is the underlying difficulties and why can't we just put a stop to it right now and just be done with it?
That's a great question. I think it actually goes hand in hand with the career. There's not really a formal trade, but like the career of threat hunting, which is always, if you look at the assumption of threat hunting, is that the attackers have been in there, they're doing their stuff, and you're hunting to find out, okay, where are they hiding to kick them out? That in itself psychologically has this, we'll call it a behavioral framework, a set of rules, almost like the Cold War, which is always, hey, don't start a war, but go ahead and have information flowing around and being stolen and stuff like that. And then what happened was with ransomware was that whole model broke because it wasn't a situation where, oh, look at that, I found something that was 4 years old in the network. Wow. That with ransomware, that's not the case. There's a finality to it where just collecting, suddenly you have a situation where it's not where you have, I don't know, allergies and you eventually figure it out and get medicine. Now it's like we have cancer, right? And if the doctor doesn't find it in time, then that evidence they collected changes from something that's preventative to an autopsy. And so whenever on LinkedIn, I'm very careful to not get involved when someone comes back and first of all, when they insult the clients and the rest of the industry and says, "Oh, they must not know what they were doing." I'm like, these people are highly motivated and they make 10 times as much as you in a month. And so that's not it, right? These are good people getting hit. But also they say, "Oh, look, I found it in the data." And I'm like, "Oh, great. So it's an autopsy. Quit calling it a discovery. Like it's an autopsy." And the solution we did was we kind of stepped back and we said, we're not going to get into the whole product sales pitch, but like we said, okay, we need to find a way to move the autopsy to before it's too late. So that's been the biggest difference is it's essentially a very rapid speeding up of the threat hunting and get enough data and enough variables to make an accurate decision, or at least accurate enough decision before it's too late and you're stuck just saying some guy comes in and says, I found it, and you're like, dude, it's been a month and like the business is bankrupt, sorry. And so that's kind of where we saw the shift happening.
And it's almost there's the whole concept of kill chain, right? And even accidents, right? So you aerial accidents. They're saying that it's not like what is the end result of series of steps, the things that happened along the way that could have at each moment in time you could have stopped it. Is
Right.
this concept also true in the realm of ransomware? Can we stop at any moment to before it gets to the point, the kind of the end of result where everything is encrypted and you can't get the keys?
Absolutely. The chain of events for the extortion. Now, we're going to talk about the most mature or professional actors. It starts with, and we watched this evolve as well. While Cyber Crucible has been growing, we've also watched the attackers change and grow and learn on this new extortion and blackmail path. They start with the identity access information. What I mean by that is like API keys. They've learned they can grab passwords. They've learned to bypass the MFA problem by grabbing your session tokens and hijacking it. So we've seen that as well. I think in Linux, they had a Google session token that was taken recently, and that caused a whole bunch of problems. So they start there. What's interesting is like on the sales pitches, when we talk about preventing the theft of tokens and things like that, and crypto wallet keys and all kind of stuff, is that the IT folks think that they're after me for my money, for my goods. I'm only an IT person. And then the CEOs and the COOs are like, oh, they're after me for my company. And it's actually reversed. What we're seeing is that there's again the most professional and well practiced of the attackers is if it's a CEO, they have a high net worth, right? HNW, that they can be blackmailed personally for their wealth. And we've seen that where they've gotten access to a refresh token to log into a website and then get something embarrassing and go after them personally. But the CEO normally, those companies, right? I think all the IT people will nod emphatically. They don't have access to like Active Directory. They're not domain admins. They're kept away from that stuff, right? Because Lord knows what they would do, right? And so then the IT admins think they're after them for their wealth, but they're not wealthy enough. All of us engineers, right? We're not wealthy enough to matter compared to the CEO of some big company. So the IT admins are very important into coercing them, getting something embarrassing or otherwise coercing them into helping to get into their company. So that's like the first step. From there, it breaks down because it's okay. I got hackers. I got my cloud token here. I got dashboard access to the EDR, the backup solution, whatever. I can go ahead and start stealing data, get all the rest of credentials, get customer lists, things like that. The last step after all of that is actually the ransomware. That's the final, what I call the monetization of the attack, right? Other times you'll see where it's not even the same person doing the extortion, that they have this initial access folks who are really good at getting into places, and then they'll sell that access. And then the more preparation they do for the extortionist, the higher the price. So we've seen that as well. So that's really a chain of events, right? And what we've seen is a maturity on the monetization of every step of the way to make sure that they can get the most value for their activities.
And companies spend exuberant amount of money to trying to prevent that with an EDR, XDR, the flavor of the month on endpoint security, and then they're running MSSPs with SOC centers to review the logs. There's just so many layers, and with all of that, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong. And I'll give an example. One is a misconfigured EDR solution that they've installed and it's just not doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Right.
To endless alerts that crying wolf, and then the one thing that really matters and nobody cares. But there's a whole slew of reasoning why all those different measures don't work. So why even bother? Why even have all of those?
It's
Because
funny, I did a post about I used like a word association, and there's this post about this Arabic term, inshallah, God willing,
yeah,
and it
yeah.
was used incorrectly. I always watch the imams always get mad because they were just kind of like, oh, the cup broke, inshallah. And it's like, that's not how you're supposed to use that. First, I'm not Muslim, so I'm not like, oh, I'm going to walk away slowly from that one. But this fatalistic kind of attitude. So I think the first thing to know is that every single attack that I've ever found, no matter how advanced, I'm talking like hiding stuff in SSL negotiations packets and like crazy covert channels and all kind of stuff, right? There was always some kind of indicator somewhere in the XDR telemetry. Now it was buried, and God help anyone to actually have the time to find that. There's not enough people in the world, but once you could start associating data points, you found the data. So it's not really a data problem in the sense that there's always like a shadow once you know what you're looking for. The cause, in a way, there's probably some lawyer in your audience that's like, that's not how you use that word. But to hone in on that, you're like, oh, there it is, which is annoying for people after the attack. In terms of the kind of like the response, I will say that even in the early beta stages of Cyber Crucible, we realized in many cases we were last tool standing. And we had to really look into that. And at first it was because they didn't really know who we were for the first couple months or whatever. Then we realized, oh, what's happening is that part of the recipe is that they're disabling the EDRs. They're actually sometimes firewalling off the XDR servers so that the SOC and the SIM and everything's nice and quiet for you, just spray painting the security cameras. And so we found that even if a tool might have a chance to find something, it didn't matter because they had already put the guards to sleep and the security cameras had spray paint and there was little old Cyber Crucible, like the only thing left, right? And we're like, okay, we better work. And so that's matured since. We actually do demos now where we've gotten code from online. We'll actually take the clients like EDR and we'll show the attack and it loads it. And we'll talk about how the loader in a second. And then the EDR is essentially blinded during the attack. We've seen where it is then re-enabled after the attack so that it looks like it never stopped working, which is that's rude. But they do that to the point as well, though, and I'm all over the place, and I apologize. So what we're seeing is we haven't seen a hacker.exe in quite a while. The tradecraft has changed to an in-memory style attack. And that's very frustrating for your watchers, quite honestly, and for our buyers and everything else, because they'll watch EDR vendor A come in and they'll have a hash that VirusTotal shows 90% coverage on, and they'll scan it and show how great their tool is, and the balloons will fall from the sky. And then EDR vendor 2, 3, 4, 5 come in, and it's all the same story, right? And they're looking for that like magical hash. What we're seeing is that they're not even using new malware anymore. The idea of chasing that new hash is gone. They're just living it in memory now. And they're using like 2, 3-year-old malware sometimes. And they're just the EDR, if it's even still functioning, is just hiding for the fjords, just sitting there quietly. And the hackers do their thing, and then they move away, and there's no file to scan. And then you get the behavioral stuff left, and that during the autopsy. So that's kind of what we're seeing more and more now. We had to invent a memory behavior analytic actually, because we are just like, okay, because we were seeing normal applications that were whitelisted that were the culprit. We were just like, okay, Visio cannot be what is doing this. And so there's obviously a takeover process. So we've seen that.
And I've seen vendors that trying to solve the problem, right? Through in-memory virtualization. There's all kinds of stuff. And
Right.
some of them even, I don't know if they offer, they say, you don't have to get insurance. We cover it. You install our system and then you're safe.
Yeah, I've looked into that. There were so many holes. It's an interesting segue back to what you had said earlier about don't go to the dark side. So
Yeah.
I went over the policies that I could also be a vendor that did that. And there were so many holes in the policy that were put in there to protect the insurer. And it wasn't like that just shows you how off all the actuarial tables are, that like they're in defensive mode. And I realized like I would essentially be one more vendor punting an insurance plan. Remember like when we were like in college and stuff, and there was like you could buy like the used car insurance plan and you found that it didn't actually cover anything that ever broke in the car and you're still stuck paying. It was kind of like that. And I was like, now I'm the like guy at the used car sales manager desk letting you an insurance plan to some kid that I know very well will not cover that engine. And so that's why we decided not to. It was just like I couldn't look at myself in the mirror because the situations to get the payout are so limited. Great example. There's one famous warranty document out there that says that you have to have the Windows Shadow like copy backup, like the Windows backups enabled. And I was like, oh, great. Good thing that for the past 3 years, that has been automatically nuked or corrupted by every single campaign ever. And so I was like, there you go. That's missing your paperwork from the mechanic. that you already know no one gets.
So you think that was a coincidence, or you think it was by design that the
Oh, you know what? I you know how, like, sometimes you think it's all malice, and then you realize that some bureaucrat was just like, "Yes, backups are good." And then they move on to being soap dishes or something, and you're, like, thinking it's a conspiracy. I have no idea. I have no idea.
and if we talk about cyber insurance, they're so behind. They're, I've talked to brokers and people that are in the cybersecurity insurance space, and they are catching up to certain things, and they do have a lot of experience with ransomware due to the fact there is so many companies that got hit. So they have a grasp of the impact associated with ransomware and the type of ransomware that in what it takes to mitigate and bring the company back online. But it seems like it's so evolving. It's and you mentioned like when you created a product, you had to reinvent yourself and then move to in-memory scanning and behavior analysis in memory. So it's a cat and mouse competition. And then introducing a new vector, which is the AI associated with the ability to potentially generate almost endless number of malware through a very quick iterative process over and over again.
Right.
What's your take on that, and where are we going? Can you use potentially AI to mitigate and then again just create the same version but as a defender as opposed to an attacker?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've done work with machine learning and AI, whatever. I think first, it seems like we have more success with using the machine learning kind of stuff and wrapping it in layers of robotic process analytics, essentially, where it's kind of like, okay, it's like asking one of my kids, of course, if this is recorded and then I'll play it back for their wedding day. Like they're young teenagers, but it's like you ask them for directions on something and you're not quite sure what is gonna come out of their mouth is something that you can like, I wouldn't, like, learn how to use a chainsaw from something that they produce, right? Like, I'll end up without an arm. And so it reminds me of that, where, like, the AI we've seen will produce things, and sometimes you'll even the code that's reading the code as well, you'll see where it's just, "Oh, this is really smart," and then in the middle of that, it's just some insanity that no rational person would ever come up with.
It's because of the if you really look at the underlying AI, it's just a massive neural network that's trying to predict what is the kind of the next character, the next word. And it does it through an iterative process in huge computational powers and iterative loop, but it's not really intelligent. And it looks intelligent. It almost feels intelligent,
Right,
but
right.
as you mentioned, it every once in a while you throw in like a craziness. You go, what is that? And that is true for the code.
That's a tough place to run a company from, right? Whether you're on the buyer side or you're a vendor or so whenever I saw like I'll see like some of those remote management tools and they'll have the how-to instructions for how to like administer Windows done by Chat GPT, the newest in their competitors. And I'm like, oh great. So you have a 20% chance of just dropping in the entire Active Directory database in your company by carefully following instructions of the insane AI. And then that's how I feel saw a security tool that said what chat GPT powered security analytics or something like that. And I was like, okay, that's there's a lot of marketing there, but
Microsoft just released a tool that is supposed to help with the malware detection and so on. And maybe just because this we're still at the baby steps of this technology,
yeah,
you're right. When the Wright brothers created a plane, the first it crashed quite a few times, and I think we're there.
we're at the crash. I agree, 100%
We're in the
agree.
crash because we're building it while we're flying as well.
And I think part of the problem in my eyes is that it loses face because of the potential because they're not being realistic of where it is, right? And so I think if they were more realistic of where it is, then we'd have more confidence in the vision, where it's going. But if someone's watching Wright Brothers in the background and they're crashing into a sandbar and the salesman's out front talking about SR-71 super speed, and you're just kind of, I just saw the guy crash, and I think that's where we're at, right? The marketing folks maybe need to, there's a what that old skit, simmer down now, which is probably dates myself, but and calm down.
They cannot. Then it's because everyone has to do that at the same time. Otherwise, you look like you're behind.
That's a
I
good
think that
point.
that is the problem. If everybody were like honest and upfront in terms of capabilities, then we didn't have to have all of that.
That's
But
a great point.
because everybody's moving the same, and you don't want to be behind, and then the CEO comes over and say, "What is going on? Why are our marketing propaganda is not as impactful as everyone else?"
That's a really
Yeah,
good point.
you
Yeah.
know. And speaking of this, why don't you talk to me about what you do in the company? I'd love to just do the elevator pitch and also talk about what's the best way to engage with you and maybe some success stories that you can provide just for people to be aware. And I love to promote your company as well.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm CEO of a product company. We call it Cyber Crucible. The whole meaning behind that name was I was trying to find a word for something that would people think it's like a deeply religious thing. And I'm like, no, it's just that since I always saw that the attack was always in the noise, and I said, I'm going to build automated ways of finding authoritatively and then removing or stopping the threat just like in when you get I've never done this, but whenever you get like a metallurgy and then like eventually the impurities get baked out, right? And that's the idea. So we have a company that specializes on automation. We do use machine learning and stuff like that. And we have an endpoint product, it's called. It's just a piece of Windows software. And that's where the hackers are living. Like we're developing other OSs, but it's like the number of attacks are so minuscule compared to Windows. And what we do is we said we're going to automatically find a way to find the hackers, survive the hackers trying to shut us off, and then automatically stop the business continuity issue. And so what that did was that moved us to a preventative solution using kernel analytics, it's called. So that's a whole bunch of buzzwords, but basically we're really deep in the operating system and we can spot a hacker very quickly and say, you are trying to steal identity data, you're trying to steal data, or you're trying to hopefully not execute ransomware. In the last quarter, we've seen 11% of the clients we did stop an attack. They all had EDRs, XDRs, and 50% of the desktops had at least one identity issue where something in a browser or something else tried to get their hands on an OAuth token or a API key or a crypto wallet or something like that. So it's definitely a major hidden issue that comes to light with ransomware.
And how does the deployment look like if somebody wanted to listen to this and wanted to give it a try? And again, it's really interesting that you mentioned that the majority of them had tools already in place. Would your solution displace that? Do you still have to have the EDR and XDR, or is it something that you can just go out and maybe use?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most folks, so we're seeing under the behind the scenes where folks are playing a little bit of a playground game where they bought into the whole like whatever complete package that is for that vendor, and then they've had an issue and they're moving from one to the other. So I'm not gonna very careful not to get into that game because the 9 o'clock sales pitch, they're like, oh, I hate Sophos, it missed the attack, and then whatever. I'm moving to Sentinel One. And then okay, here's our product, and then the 10 o'clock meeting, I hate Sentinel One. I'm moving to Sophos. But it's okay. We're just not going to get involved in that purchasing cycle. And so we've seen where some folks, because they have our product, have scaled down on the services side or they've lost headcount. And they're like, you know what? I went looking for an automated tool and I found Cyber Crucible. I can't afford to look at my 10 million alerts a day or down to 1 million alerts a day or whatever. And I need something automated. And so we've seen that happen. We try to get involved in that world and let the customer come to their own conclusions, about that. I will tell you that there's a great use case that showed where we don't work. And that was interesting to me because, of course, what is security? It's all about boundaries. Okay, where am I not looking? We're behavioral based, right? We had a client who had, and we'll talk about deployment in a second, but they had us on two machines, right, that are important to this discussion. One, they both got remote access tools. So they both got these like identity theft, data theft tools put on them. The one did not receive, so machine A did not receive tasking from the hacker to go do anything. Machine B immediately started trying to find credit card numbers and things like that. And we stopped it preventatively. There was an EDR, unnamed EDR. I never name or shame on the tool, on the systems. What happened was that on the one that machine B, we saw the behavior, we stopped it. Machine A it just sat there quietly. 2 weeks later, like a signature based tool they had found the malware and kicked it out. And of course the client is like, how come you only found one? It's really interesting in that it showed the value of having signature based, old fashioned security that found the file eventually that hadn't been tasked. The one that did take action course, we found it right away. And yeah, you can say the tool was trapped and that if it would have moved, we would have like a T-Rex moment for Jurassic Park. Where we were like, you can't move. But that's interesting to me for me to say, okay, you know what? I see where my bread's buttered and it's on behaviors and where hackers do stuff if they just sit there sleeping.
So you still need to turn the firewalls on and patch and everything else. It's not like you're installing
Yeah.
your software and then you just let everything go.
And that's where I see some people on the sales side as a CEO. It always concerned me. I've seen some like resellers or MSPs, and they'll say things like, "This is the last tool you will ever need," and I'm like, "Oh, it's like QVC," and then they're caught with egg on their face because they had essentially blocked themselves out from future sales because they were so adamant this one product, the one firewall or whatever it is, was the last thing you ever need.
And Dennis, do you fall into a certain category? Like I know Gartner always come out with this emerging tech or certain buckets of projects. So where do you fall in? Which category do you fall in? So because enterprise move in tandem, you just have everything has to be scheduled and projected. That you can't just go out and
Right.
install something. So where do you
Right.
fall in?
You
Which
know,
category?
it's really interesting because the security market is fragmented, right, with different line items and different budget items, right? So if the people that contact us just had a data theft, maybe ransomware too, but they're like, look, I can never lose those formulas again, like maybe a pharma company, then they look at us and like, oh yeah, you prevent data loss, so you're in the DLP bucket, and I'm just like, yes, okay, Mr. Customer, yes. And then the folks that are on the identity side, maybe like for instance, we have a mental health clinic, drug abuse, stuff like that, and they had the identities of their patients who were and employees stolen. And the nurses and the doctors and all that were very concerned about that. That shouldn't go out. And I guess that's like women's shelter type stuff, right? And they were like, "Oh, you're like an IAM tool. You're protecting all the identities." And we're like, "Yep, okay, customer, yep, sure, let's put it on that budget line." And then for the ransomware side, a lot of times, if they are the traditional like security malware kind of shop, then they dump us into the EDR, kind of like XDR bucket, because that's the budget they have. And so we're seeing where it depends on the entry point and the pain point of the person to understand the value. And we actually have three different demos, the one depending on what they want to see. And then the fact that it does other things too, it just complicates things, right? They just like they're focused on that one piece.
And who would be the kind of the buyer persona that is the easiest to talk to and explain this? Again, it's complicated, has a very specific use case, and maybe the kind of the underlying question for that is who's your ideal customer? The early adopter that can just go out and just decide that this is a great tool for them.
That's a great question. The people who know about either they know about defense in depth and they're on the security team and they're like, I got to have a tool. I can't just trust this one vendor with, I can't get fired because I want to trust this one vendor. All the big names have been beaten. The other folks that we see that are really pushing the sale a lot of times is the business leadership. It's really interesting. I think that also it's this unholy triad of the hackers got tired of being ignored, essentially, and they started taking out the business leaders saying, I got to save my business. And then what I noticed, and I saw this in 2020, and it's only gotten better for our company, honestly, is that as the security vendors keep getting beaten, their marketing pitches keep getting grander and grander. Just like with AI, right? Where suddenly they're like data from Star Trek, and we're like, no, it's the same tool as last week. It's a bit of a trap, right? Because it just enhances the dissatisfaction from the business leadership. If a CISO or a security guy is, no, we got to cover, and the business guy is, I talked to the CFO, we're in the red for 18 months. You're not covered, trust me. Like, then that's what's driving it. So it seems like more and more the business leadership is actually talking to the technologists, and it's almost two different sales pitches, right? Because then we have to bring out our engineers to show them how better we are and differentiated and talk geek speak, right? But the CEO and the COO and the CFO are the ones that are saying, hey, check this out because I just talked to Bill and I can't have that happen to me. And that's what's happening.
And cyber insurance companies now mandate, for example, MFA, maybe PAM solutions, privilege access
Right.
management solutions, and so on, to as a precursor to maybe renewing a policy
100%.
or getting. Do you see a tool like yours to potentially be in that category to help prevent ransomware and protect the business as part of the overall arsenal of tools?
That's a great question. So we're actually seeing where there are even insurance companies that are selling our stuff with umbrella policies for like personal network protection kind of stuff because of the identity theft prevention, what I'd really like to see is actually it's good is that if enough customers, targets, we'll call them, right? If enough targets were not using MFA, then the hackers wouldn't care about going after OAuth tokens and API keys. But what's happened is that there's been enough really hard work by people like you and other vendors to get that MFA in place. And it's been going on for years, right? And it's, of course, everyone is frustrated that everyone doesn't have MFA, right? All the security guys are frustrated. But then what happens is that enough of them have actually adopted MFA that the attackers change tactics a little bit, right? Where they said, okay, I'm going to go around the MFA and I'm going to get the token that they get after they put the MFA code in, right? So it's actually a positive story. Yes, we're working on that, but it's a positive story in that, look, guys, they're not just looking for the ABC 123 passwords anymore. Like we're mature enough now, we're making progress now that we're actually having to adapt to them having to work harder, which is a really good place to be. It sounds like it stinks, but it isn't. It's a good place to be.
And it does provide you a false sense of security where you actually have an MFA built into your organization, and even password policies and security awareness training and all of that, that they still, it's good to have. And for sure, it's prevents a lot of incidents, but it's not the be all and end all. As you mentioned, the adversary just have to work a little harder and potentially just they circumvent some of these existing tools.
Right. I'm
Um,
a big fan of them working harder. That should be the game plan every day.
and it's a risk reward, and it's also just would you spend 1,000 hours trying to get into a safe there with $100? Not, but if it takes you 2 minutes, then $100 seems like a good deal. So it's about just the amount of effort required, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you didn't answer the question about how the deployment look like and whether it plays well with others at the endpoint. If it scales, a lot of times companies with like hundreds of thousand desktops or like the, it's one thing to deploy it on 10 machines. It's one and completely another to deploy on hundreds of these. And then doesn't matter which version of Windows. So there's all kind of probably questions you get asked all the time
All the
when
time. If we get asked a question a couple times, we put a knowledge base article out about it actually, and then we get to pull out the knowledge. You'll have to be careful if someone's asking questions right before the buy. You don't want to be like, look at the knowledge base. You guys got to be careful to be
you
like, well, here, let me
also
show you this article that you've had all along.
yeah, but you also don't want to give them any ideas. Sometimes you maybe there's some questions you don't want to be asked, so you like
Yes,
don't
it's
look
a
at the
hard
Q and
enough
A.
problem. So deployment is on 2021 and 2022. I worked really hard, and there's something in investing in finance called TAM and a SAM, a total addressable market and a serviceable rate. And I said, you know what? This is a problem that's hitting non-technical like mechanic shops and bakeries and things like that, just like it's hitting banks and merchant services and
Mhm.
places like that, right? So one of my big successes was that the deployment was automated enough and resilient enough that a body shop basically was able to deploy it in 20 minutes and get that deployed and up and running. And so that was like the low end of the spectrum in terms of technical know-how, right? And support. And then all the way up to we've had major enterprises with well-funded budgets that have proprietary tools and everything else that have done a really great job of deploying it and gaining a lot of value as well. So for me, that was the big test, right? Can I be valuable to the big bank? And can I be valuable to the mechanic shop that is just doing like body work all day? So that's been a nice mix. We work on Windows 2000, what is it, like 2008 R2, I think, all the way up to the most modern one. The reason why we stopped working on the older ones actually without like we can do custom stuff. But what happened was that beyond Windows not supporting those systems anymore, they actually started changing the APIs that we use for our driver development and our service development, where it wouldn't even work on the old stuff. So whenever we realized they were taking them offline, Microsoft, right, we were like downloading all the old kits real quick to be like, we better keep these because 10 years from now, we know what's going to happen. So we've done that. And so we'll do like custom builds for older stuff. But usually it's okay, guys. Can we talk about maybe an upgrade, maybe to 2008? And but it's a good place to be because like we can cover a really wide range of environments very quickly and automatically, which is great.
And I'm assuming that the deployment will start with a fairly limited number of machines, and then it will go from there. Does it? It's not something you happens overnight. We have to plan it, right? So, does the end user experience changes? Because you probably get asked that as well.
Most end users don't even know they have it. What I found is that a significant portion of the time, I can't think of a percentage, but the client or the prospect at that point doing a proof of concept, right? Or a limited deployment. In an IT admin world, you normally don't deploy new software to the CEO's laptop. You just don't, right? Because if something happens, you don't know what's going to happen yet, and you don't want to be fired, right? What we're seeing is that even though they sometimes are playing it really cool, oh, we're going to put in a couple workstations in the corner and no one's going to use. And then we look at our telemetry and they've thrown our software on like the Active Directory servers, the heart of the business. And we're like, not where I would test new software, no matter how much I trust it, but it just shows you how much stress and emotion is behind. They're worried. And we've had this happen where we're running a proof of concept. There was like a famous picture in Galveston, Texas, where like the one house was left standing on the beach after the hurricane. You remember that? So that's happened to us before. We're like, our three machines are up and everything, the whole business is new. And we're like, oh,
Well,
well,
definitely vote of confidence to deploy your software on the Active Directory.
I know, and it's hard because if I'm on the line, I'll say, "Maybe don't do that," and then if it's like an IT admin, they're like, "Yeah, don't do that." But if it's like a business person, they're like, "What? You're not confident in your product?" And I'm like, No, it's best practice. Don't choose the biggest needle to start with whenever you're like trying to draw blood at the nurse's station."
And then it's you should definitely trademark the body shop test. Like, if that's it should be as easy as to deploy it for a body shop as it is. So that's the starting point. I think that's something you should definitely look into.
Right.
So Dennis, thank you very much. Let me ask you the last question. What's the easiest way for people to reach out to you, to know more about you, about the company, and potentially maybe look into testing this out?
Absolutely, yeah. So I've noticed that the calling into the company is a problem I have to work on in that it seems like everyone is always on the phone and I need to upscale that. But if you want to get hold of me, the best way really is LinkedIn. Just I have 11,000 followers. I speak to probably 100 of them at a time. And the beauties of modern social media, right? But feel free to reach out and say hi. Happy to connect. I do not spam people. Even when I have little things to reach out to try to get their attention, I try to impart value in every message. But feel free to reach out to me and say hello. And I'll probably bring a salesperson or a technologist along if we have a Zoom call. That's mostly, honestly, because I'll get a phone call from something and then I'll be off like squirrel. And then the having an employee on the phone with me keeps me honest, or I bail on meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, Dennis, first of all, you're very passionate about what you do, and it's as evident not from what you say, how you say it. And then you're also very transparent and honest. Listen, anybody who's listening to this podcast, it can tell you don't mince words, you say what's on your mind. And you're like one of the best of the entrepreneurs kind, basically looking at a problem that he couldn't solve, and it wasn't anything off the shelf, and you went out and built it, which is not an easy task. So kudos to you for making that plunge.
I
So
always laugh when someone looks at our slides. Like we had a VC out of Baltimore that the guy was like giggling and taking screenshots and thinking he was gonna go and make it or something. I don't know what he was thinking, but I was just like, "Oh, you sweet summer child, you have no idea how much work and how many mistakes and money went into getting this far. Good luck. Have at it."
yeah, that's the thing, right? Ideas a dime a dozen. It's the execution that matters, and then it's a moving target. Like it's something that you build something today. In 6 months, things can be completely different. As you mentioned, you had to reinvent yourself a few times.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for joining me, Dennis. Much appreciated. This was a very great conversation. I learned a lot, which is hopefully people that join us as well. And then until the next time, thanks to all of those who join us, and looking forward to seeing the next episode. And stay safe online as well as offline. I'll see you soon. Thanks, Dennis. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.